What if everything the church told you about Jesus was actually a watered-down version of an advanced technology we forgot how to use? A scientist in the Arizona desert just learned this from a dying alien, and what he discovered will shatter everything you believe about faith, reality, and your own potential. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about the suppressed science of consciousness that's been hidden for 2,000 years. This extraterrestrial didn't come to preach. It came to repair a living machine that responds to human emotion, and in doing so, it revealed that love isn't a feeling. It's a measurable frequency that literally reorganizes matter. Once you see this connection, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. This will awaken something powerful inside you, but it might cost you the certainty you've lived with your entire life. If you're ready to see what those in power never wanted you to know, subscribe and hit that bell, because what happened to Lucas Whitford in that rocky canyon will fundamentally change how you see yourself, God, and the universe we inhabit. Now let me tell you how a broken scientist met a being from the stars and found the divine. Lucas Whitford was 44 years old and worked alone in the Arizona desert. He spent days and nights collecting geological data without rest. After the divorce, he had taken refuge in solitude as a defense against pain. Science was his anchor, his fortress, and his escape. He hadn't believed in God for many years. The rocky plateau near Page was his only companion. On that particular night, the wind blew hot and silent. Lucas walked among the reddish formations with equipment in his backpack. The mechanical work was the only way not to feel the emptiness inside. He had been out there for 3 weeks straight. His ex-wife used to say he was running away. Maybe she was right. But out here, among ancient stone and star-filled silence, he didn't have to think about what he'd lost. Didn't have to face the hollow space where faith used to live. The samples tonight were routine. Sediment analysis, mineral composition. Cold, hard facts that never lied or left or stopped making sense. That's what he needed. That's all he needed. Then the sky opened. A blue spiral tore through the darkness without warning. The light spun as if bending the atmosphere itself. Lucas stopped mid-step, his breath catching. The spiral wasn't like anything he'd seen before. Not lightning, not meteor, not military flare. It was rotating, deliberately, impossibly. The ground shook beneath his feet, lifting fine dust into the air. His equipment rattled in the backpack. Somewhere in the distance, rocks tumbled down canyon walls. The sound rolled across the plateau like distant thunder. Something fell between the stones with a muffled roar. Lucas stood frozen for 3 seconds. His scientific mind screamed meteor impact, but meteors don't spiral. They don't bend light. They don't move with intention. Then curiosity overtook caution. He ran toward the impact site, moved more by curiosity than by faith. His boots hit the sand hard, kicking up small clouds with each stride. The blue light still pulsed on the horizon, casting strange shadows across the red rock formations. As he got closer, the air changed. It felt thicker, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, but sustained. Wrong. His skin prickled. Lucas rounded a large boulder and stopped. In a deep ravine ahead, something glowed with impossible blue radiance. Not fire, not electricity, something alive. The light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat made visible. He approached the edge carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rational part of his brain cataloged details. No smoke, no burning smell, temperature normal. But rationality was losing ground fast, because what lay in that ravine shouldn't exist. Lucas descended slowly, his hands finding holds in the rock face. Loose stones skittered down ahead of him, disappearing into the blue glow below. His throat was dry. His hands were shaking. When his feet touched the ravine floor, he looked up and found the impossible breathing in the sand. Metal, but not metal. A craft of some kind, partially buried, its surface shifting between solid and liquid states. The hull pulsed with that blue radiance, each pulse slightly weaker than the last. Next to it, something moved. Lucas's entire worldview, 44 years of accumulated certainty, cracked down the middle, because lying there, struggling to rise, was a being that couldn't be real, yet was. Gray skin that seemed to shimmer in its own light, a body too thin, too elongated, and eyes, large, dark, bottomless, that turned toward him with unmistakable intelligence. Lucas stood there, a broken scientist in a broken night, watching the impossible struggle for life. Everything he knew said this couldn't be happening. Everything he felt said it was. And in that moment, suspended between disbelief and wonder, Lucas Whitford's carefully constructed world began to dissolve. The walls he'd built from equations and evidence started to crumble. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover something his science had never taught him. Something the church had tried to tell him but got wrong. Something that would crack open the universe and show him what was really underneath. But first, he had to decide: run or stay, deny or accept, hide or help. The being's eyes met his across the ravine floor, and Lucas took his first step forward into a reality bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. In the deep ravine, there was living metal burning with blue light. The craft appeared semi-buried, as if it had slid across the ground before coming to rest. The hull pulsed like a heart hungry for energy. Beside it, the gray being tried to rise again. Its skin was translucent and revealed bluish veins beneath. The black eyes gleamed like wet obsidian. It staggered and fell, exhausted and silent. Lucas approached without understanding why he wasn't running. Every instinct should have sent him scrambling back up that ravine wall. Every survival mechanism should have been screaming danger, unknown, flee, but he kept walking forward. The being turned its head slightly, tracking his movement. There was no aggression in that gaze, no threat, just awareness, and something that looked disturbingly like hope. Lucas was 3 meters away when it happened. The voice came directly into his mind. The machine failed. He jerked backward, nearly tripping over loose rock. His hand flew to his head, as if he could physically block out the intrusion. But the voice hadn't come through his ears. It had simply appeared inside his thoughts. The phrase came soft, calm, and conscious. "Don't let me fade," said the being with a thread of light. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. His scientific training demanded explanation. Telepathy wasn't real. Couldn't be real. The human brain didn't work that way. Neural signals required physical pathways. Thoughts didn't transfer through empty space. But this was happening anyway. The being's chest rose and fell rapidly. Its breathing labored. Whatever it was dying. Lucas could see that much. The blue light from the craft was dimming with each pulse, and the being's translucent skin was losing its luminosity. He knelt down slowly, his backpack sliding off his shoulders. Science didn't explain telepathy, but it was happening. That was the thing about being a real scientist. You followed the evidence, even when it shattered your models. Especially when it shattered your models. "Okay," Lucas said aloud, his voice rough. "What do you need?" The being's large eyes focused on him with startling intensity. For a moment, no response came. Then, like a whisper in a cathedral, "Connection. The core is damaged. Without it, I am incomplete." Its hand, 3 long fingers too delicate for its body, gestured weakly toward the craft. Lucas looked at the pulsing hull. Up close, he could see the damage. A long fracture ran along what he assumed was the hull's underside. Blue energy leaked from it like luminous blood, dissipating into the sand. "I'm a geologist, not an engineer," Lucas said. But even as the words left his mouth, he was moving toward the craft. The human instinct to help had spoken louder than fear. He reached out tentatively, his fingertips hovering just above the surface. Heat radiated from it, but not burning heat. Something else, like standing near another person. Body warmth, life warmth. His fingers made contact. The metal, if it was metal, felt smooth and warm and somehow responsive. It shifted slightly under his touch, as if acknowledging his presence, as if it knew he was there. "How is this possible?" Lucas breathed. "Your kind built walls between science and spirit." The being's voice came again, gentler now. "They were never separate, never meant to be." Lucas pulled his hand back. That statement, those words, they struck something deep, something he'd buried under years of empirical research and controlled experiments. He looked back at the creature. It had managed to prop itself up on one elbow, though the effort clearly cost it. The veins beneath its skin pulsed weakly, out of sync with the craft's diminishing rhythm. "I don't understand," Lucas said. "You will." The being's mental voice carried something that felt like a smile. "You already do. You've just forgotten." Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to demand concrete explanations, but the being was fading. He could see it happening in real time, the light dimming, the breathing becoming more shallow. He made a decision. "Tell me what to do," he said, kneeling beside the craft. "I'll try." The being's eyes closed briefly, as if in relief or gratitude. When it spoke again, the voice was steadier, more focused. The core, inside, follow the light. Your hands will know. Lucas looked down at his hands, rough, calloused, stained with red desert dust. These hands had held rock samples and calibration tools and divorce papers. Nothing that prepared them for this. But when he looked back at the dying being, he knew he would try anyway. Because some things transcended understanding. Some things you just did. He said quietly, "I'll try." Lucas observed the craft as if analyzing an unknown mineral. His eyes traced the contours, looking for patterns, for logic, for something his training could map onto the familiar. But nothing about this was familiar. The hull changed color with his touch, reacting like living tissue. Where his fingers had pressed moments before, the surface rippled with darker blue, then settled back to its original luminescence. It was responding to him, acknowledging him, not like metal, like skin. In the center of the visible section, there was a circular core with a spiral symbol. The pattern drew his eye immediately, perfect geometric precision, yet somehow organic, mathematical and alive at the same time. The spiral seemed to rotate even when motionless. Lucas blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. But the optical illusion, if that's what it was, persisted. The spiral turned slowly, hypnotically, pulling his attention inward like water circling a drain. "That's where my life sustains itself," said the being's voice in his mind. Lucas looked back at the creature. It had managed to sit up partially, leaning against a smooth rock, but its movements were increasingly labored. The translucent quality of its skin was fading, becoming more opaque, duller. He turned his attention back to the core. The spiral was cracked. A jagged fracture ran through the symbol like a lightning bolt frozen in metal, and from that crack, light leaked like blood, slow, pulsing, diminishing with each passing moment. Lucas had seen plenty of broken things in his career: fractured geological samples, failed equipment, relationships that couldn't be repaired. He knew what irreversible damage looked like. This was close, very close. He examined the structure with improvised tools from his backpack: a small LED flashlight, a multi-tool with various attachments, a digital caliper he used for measuring mineral samples. Nothing designed for this, nothing even remotely adequate. His scientific thinking tried to keep pace with the impossible. The fracture pattern suggested impact stress. The energy leakage indicated some kind of containment failure. The pulsing rhythm implied a circulatory system, but machines didn't have circulation. Except this one did. The visitor trembled, losing strength rapidly. Its breathing had become shallow, irregular. The blue veins beneath its skin pulsed out of sync with the craft's core, like two hearts struggling to maintain the same rhythm and failing. The rocky ravine illuminated everything with supernatural brightness. Shadows stretched and contracted with each pulse of blue light. Lucas's own shadow seemed to breathe on the stone wall behind him. He felt the urgency viscerally. This wasn't an academic exercise. This was life and death. Real, immediate, happening right now. "You understand matter," the being murmured, its mental voice weaker than before. Lucas looked up from his examination. "I understand rocks, minerals. This is, you understand matter," the being repeated. "And you understand pain." The second statement came with telepathic sweetness, a gentleness that completely disarmed Lucas's rising panic. It wasn't accusation, it was recognition, kinship. Lucas felt something crack inside his chest. He'd spent 3 years running from pain, diving into work, into solitude, into the safe comfort of empirical data that never asked questions or demanded vulnerability. Science had been his escape from feeling. But this being, this impossible creature from somewhere beyond his comprehension, saw through all of it. "I don't," Lucas started, but his throat closed. "You buried yourself in stone and sand," the being continued softly, "hoping the earth would teach you not to feel. But matter remembers, and so do you." Lucas's hands shook as he reached for the fractured core. The surface was warm under his palm, pulsing with that strange life warmth he'd felt before. His fingers traced the edge of the crack, feeling how the material had split. The damage was deep, structural. Whatever this craft was, whatever impossible physics kept it functioning, the core was critical, and it was failing. He took a deep breath and began the repair. His mind raced through possibilities. The material wasn't metal. It responded to touch, to presence, to something he couldn't measure. Traditional welding wouldn't work. Adhesives would be useless. Everything in his toolkit was designed for dead matter, inert substances. This was alive. "How do I fix something living?" he asked aloud, frustration edging into his voice. The being's eyes met his across the blue-lit space, the same way anything broken is healed. With attention, with presence, with love? Lucas said it sarcastically, but the word hung in the air strangely. With coherence, the being corrected gently. The same force, different name. Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to demand technical specifications, material properties, concrete instructions. But the creature was fading fast, and his destiny was changing with every passing minute. So instead of arguing, he did something he hadn't done in years. He trusted something he couldn't measure. He placed both hands on either side of the crack and closed his eyes. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know if this would work, but he remembered what the being had said. "Your hands will know." The core pulsed under his palms, weak, irregular, dying. Lucas steadied his breathing, quieted his racing thoughts. And for the first time since the divorce, since the collapse of everything he'd believed about his life, he stopped running from what he felt. He let himself feel the brokenness. His, the being's, the craft's, all of it. And in that ravine under impossible blue light, something began to change. While Lucas worked, the being watched him in silence, not with judgment, not with impatience, just presence. A steady awareness that felt more companionable than any silence Lucas had experienced with another human. The mental connection opened stronger between them. It wasn't intrusive. That's what surprised Lucas most. The telepathy didn't feel like violation or invasion. It felt like standing in a room with someone who understood you completely and chose to stay anyway. "You carry ancient guilt," the visitor said quietly into his mind. Lucas's hands stilled on the core. His jaw tightened. He tried to ignore the statement, tried to focus on the geometric patterns of the spiral, the way the crack disrupted its perfect symmetry. But the truth hurt, and truth has a way of making itself known regardless of how deeply you bury it. "I don't want to talk about that," Lucas said aloud, his voice rough. The being touched his mind with pure compassion, not pity, not sympathy, something cleaner, more honest. It was the difference between someone feeling sorry for you and someone truly seeing you. The pain pushed you away from faith, not from light. Lucas's hands trembled as he held a small tool, the caliper, useless for this task, but familiar in his grip, something to anchor him while his entire reality shifted. "I only believe in what I can measure," he murmured. It was his standard line, his defense, the wall he'd built between himself and anything that couldn't be quantified. "Then measure me by what you feel," the being responded. The phrase echoed inside him like wind through an empty canyon. It reverberated against every certainty he'd constructed, every safe boundary he'd established between the known and the unknown. Lucas looked at the being, really looked. This creature shouldn't exist. Telepathy shouldn't work. The craft shouldn't be alive. None of this fit into his model of reality. Every measurement, every scientific principle he'd ever learned, said this was impossible. Yet here he was. Here they both were. And what he felt was undeniable. The core of the craft reacted to Lucas's emotional state. He saw it happening in real time. When his fears spiked, the pulsing became erratic. When he forced himself to calm down, to breathe steadily, the rhythm stabilized slightly. The being explained, words forming directly in Lucas's consciousness, that living machines obeyed the coherence of the heart. "I don't understand," Lucas said, but even as he spoke, part of him did. Some buried knowing was surfacing, like a memory from before memory. "Your scientists separated heart from mind," the being continued. "Emotion from thought, spirit from matter. These divisions never existed. Your own quantum physicists are starting to remember. Observation changes the observed. Consciousness affects reality." Lucas tried to concentrate while sweat beaded on his forehead. The temperature hadn't changed, but the effort of holding two contradictory worldviews simultaneously was exhausting. The visitor stated clearly, "Consciousness shapes matter," and Lucas realized he was stepping into another reality, not leaving the old one behind, seeing through it, seeing what had always been there, hidden beneath layers of assumptions and defensive skepticism. His ex-wife had tried to tell him something similar once, during their last real conversation before the lawyers got involved. She'd said he was so busy measuring life that he'd forgotten to live it, so busy quantifying everything that he couldn't feel anything. He'd dismissed it as emotional manipulation. But she'd been right. The guilt you carry, the being said, returning to the earlier thread, it's about more than your marriage. Lucas's throat tightened. He didn't want to go there. Didn't want to excavate that particular pain. You blame yourself for losing faith, the being continued gently. You think turning away from God was failure, weakness, wasn't it? Lucas's voice came out barely above a whisper. You turned away from a story that stopped making sense. That's not weakness. That's integrity. The words hit Lucas like a physical impact. His hands stilled completely on the core. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of his apostasy like a stone. The disappointment of his religious parents, the confused hurt of his ex-wife, who couldn't understand how her husband could stop believing, the shame of it. But you never stopped seeking truth, the being said. You just changed languages, from prayers to equations, from faith to evidence. Same hunger, different words. Lucas felt something shift in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. It loosened, just slightly, just enough to breathe. The core beneath his hands pulsed warmer. The blue light brightened marginally. Feel that? The being asked. Lucas nodded, not trusting his voice. Your emotional coherence affects the field around you. Everything responds. The craft, the atoms in the air, my failing biology. When you shift from guilt to understanding, from contraction to opening, matter recognizes it. Matter obeys it. That's impossible, Lucas said reflexively. Measure it, the being replied, and there was something like humor in the telepathic tone. Use your instruments. The electromagnetic field around you just changed. Your heart rate variability increased. The quantum probability states in your immediate environment shifted. Lucas looked down at his hands on the cracked core. The spiral symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat now. Synchronized, connected. He thought about every prayer he'd ever spoken that seemed to disappear into empty space. Every desperate plea that went unanswered. Everything that had driven him away from faith and into the cold comfort of measurable reality. What if he'd been asking wrong? Speaking the wrong language to a universe that operated on entirely different principles? Consciousness shapes matter, the being repeated softly. This is the science your kind forgot, the technology Jesus tried to teach. The truth hidden in every wisdom tradition, buried under ritual and dogma. Lucas's scientific mind screamed at him. This violated causality, contradicted materialism, couldn't be proven through double-blind studies. But the core was healing under his hands. He could feel it, and measurement for once seemed entirely beside the point. When the craft stabilized for a few moments, something changed in the air. Lucas felt it before he understood it, a shift in pressure, in texture, in the very quality of existence around him. The light formed a circle around the two of them, not gradually, instantly. The blue radiance from the craft mixed with something else now, something warmer. The being lifted its head with effort, its large dark eyes fixed on Lucas with sudden intensity. I need to show you something you forgot, it said. The spiral in the core ignited in pure white, not blue anymore. This was different, clean, absolute, like the light behind light. The desert disappeared from Lucas's vision. He didn't close his eyes, didn't blink. The red rocks and sand simply weren't there anymore. Instead, he stood in a space that felt both infinite and intimate. A figure walked toward him through the white radiance. Lucas's heart stopped. It was Jesus, not the stained glass version, not the Renaissance painting with the glowing halo, not the theological construct. Simple, human, serene. He wore plain robes, the kind any first-century carpenter might wear. His feet were bare. His hands showed the calluses of labor. His face was Middle Eastern, weathered by sun and wind. Everything about him was ordinary, except the light. The light around him pulsed like a living frequency. It moved with its own rhythm, its own intelligence. It wasn't coming from Jesus. It was more like Jesus was made of it. Lucas felt his entire body tremble. Every cell seemed to vibrate at a frequency just slightly off from what he'd known his whole life. And now they were adjusting, tuning, finding resonance. The warmth that emanated from the figure was familiar, ancient, and loving. Not the stern love of judgment, Not the conditional love of religious doctrine. Something cleaner, the way sunlight loves everything it touches. Lucas had been raised Christian, had gone to church every Sunday until college, had prayed and read Bible verses and done everything a good believer was supposed to do. Then he'd stopped believing. Not dramatically, just gradually, as the stories stopped making sense and the prayers stopped feeling real. He'd thought he was done with Jesus, finished with that chapter. But standing here, Lucas realized he'd never stopped wanting it to be true. He'd just stopped being able to pretend it made sense the way they'd taught him. He didn't come to prove divinity. The being's voice entered his mind, gentle but clear. The figure of Jesus stopped a few meters away. His eyes, dark, kind, infinitely patient, met Lucas's, and in that gaze, Lucas felt seen, not judged, not measured, just known, completely. He came to remind you who you are, the being continued. The vision touched memories Lucas didn't know he had. He saw himself as a child, before doubt, before skepticism, before the defensive walls. He saw the moment he'd first felt separate from the divine, not because God abandoned him, but because he'd learned to believe in separation itself. He saw his ex-wife's face the night she'd asked, "When did you stop believing in anything you couldn't measure?" Her eyes had held sadness, not accusation. He saw himself in the desert, night after night, pretending he was content with rocks and data, while his soul starved for meaning, and he understood that none of it had been wrong. The questioning, the doubting, the turning away from easy answers, it had all been necessary. A refining, a stripping away of false certainty to make room for something truer. Jesus in the vision didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence communicated directly, and what Lucas received wasn't doctrine or commandment, it was recognition. You are this too. You have always been this. You forgot, and that's okay. But you can remember now. Something inside Lucas finally yielded. Not his intellect that was still scrambling, but something deeper. The part of him that had been holding so tightly to certainty. The part that had chosen loneliness over vulnerability. That part let go. And when it did, Lucas wept. Not sad tears. Not happy tears. Release. Relief. The crying that happens when a burden you've carried so long you forgot it was heavy finally lifts. The figure of Jesus smiled. Not triumphant. Just warm. Like a friend seeing you finally understand a joke you'd been missing. Then the light intensified, and the vision dissolved. Lucas found himself back in the ravine, on his knees, both hands still on the craft's core. His face was wet, his chest heaved. The being watched him with those dark, knowing eyes. What was that? Lucas's voice broke. The truth you've always known. The being replied softly, just dressed in form you could recognize. The core beneath Lucas's hands pulsed stronger now. The crack had closed partially. Lucas stared at it, then at the being, then at his own trembling hands. He had no words, no categories, no measurements, but he knew it had been real, more real than anything else he'd ever experienced. The vision disappeared, but the vibration remained. Lucas could still feel it humming through his body, resonating in his bones. The being explained, its mental voice steady. Love is measurable frequency. Lucas looked up sharply. After everything he'd just experienced, that statement still jarred him. Love was emotion, feeling, the territory of poets, not physicists. It reorganizes matter the way music reorganizes silence. The being continued. Lucas listened without being able to breathe properly. His scientific training and his mystical experience were colliding. Faith isn't belief, the being said. It's living energy. Lucas's hands were still on the core, feeling it pulse with renewed strength. Thought guided by coherent emotion creates reality. Lucas tried to deny it, but he remembered the core reacting to his fear. Remembered how the crack had started closing when he'd stopped resisting and started feeling. The craft showed luminous patterns as he calmed himself. He watched it happen. His breathing slowed, and the light stabilized. His heart rate settled, and the blue radiance brightened. His emotional state wasn't responding to external reality. External reality was responding to his emotional state. Jesus taught this before humanity forgot, the being said, and there was something like sadness in the telepathic tone. You came from the stars and erased the memory. Lucas's hand moved to the spiral symbol. When his fingers touched it, warmth spread through his chest, actual physical heat. The visitor revealed that the spiral was a map of consciousness, not symbolic, an actual schematic of how awareness moves, grows, evolves. The shape repeated in galaxies, in cells, in souls. Lucas saw it suddenly, the same spiral he'd studied in Nautilus shells and hurricane formations, and the Milky Way's arms. He'd thought it was just mathematics. But what if the math wasn't the foundation but the result? What if consciousness came first, and matter followed? "You're made of the same architecture," the being said. Lucas looked at his own hand on the spiral. His palm print, another spiral. His DNA, a double helix, forever turning. His thoughts moved in loops and cycles, spiraling through association and memory. He'd spent his career studying rocks, minerals, dead matter. He'd thought he was studying objective reality. But rocks were made of molecules, molecules of atoms, atoms of particles that behaved differently when observed. And observation required consciousness. All the way down, consciousness was there. Lucas realized that everything made sense without making sense at all. The paradox didn't bother him anymore. Maybe true understanding always lived in paradox, the place where opposing truths stopped contradicting and started harmonizing. Jesus was human and divine, both, simultaneously. Love was feeling and force, emotion and energy, all at once. Faith was letting go and holding on, surrender and certainty. And consciousness was both created and creator. The technology Jesus demonstrated, the being continued, was the technology of coherent consciousness. When you align thought, emotion, and intention, when you achieve internal resonance, you broadcast a frequency, and matter responds. That's not miracle, it's law. Lucas thought about the healings in the Bible stories, always prefaced with, "Your faith has healed you." He'd assumed it was metaphor. But what if it was literal? What if the healed person's shift into coherent belief actually reorganized their biology? What if Jesus didn't give them healing but showed them how to access what was always possible? "Why did we forget?" Lucas asked aloud. "Fear," the being answered simply. "Fear of power, fear of responsibility. Easier to worship an external God than recognize divinity within. Safer to pray for intervention than learn to be the intervention." The core pulsed warm beneath Lucas's hands. He could feel it almost completely healed now. He'd done that, somehow. Not through technical knowledge, through something else entirely. Jesus didn't come to be worshipped, the being said gently. He came to be remembered, not the person, the possibility, the proof of what human consciousness can become when it remembers its origin. Lucas sat back on his heels, overwhelmed. His entire worldview had shattered and reassembled. Nothing was where he'd left it, but instead of feeling lost, he felt found. The being's eyes held infinite patience. "You understand now," it said. Lucas nodded slowly. Not intellectually, he'd need years to integrate this, but he understood the way you understand how to breathe. Deeper than thought. True. Love wasn't just emotion. It was the organizing principle of reality itself. Lucas stepped away from the craft, stunned. His legs felt unsteady. The weight of what he'd just experienced pressed down on him like physical force. He relived the divorce and the guilt that had been eating at him. It came flooding back, not as distant memory, but as immediate pain. The arguments that went in circles, the silences that stretched for days, the moment she'd finally said she couldn't do this anymore. He remembered his ex-wife saying he had lost himself. They'd been sitting in the kitchen, the divorce papers between them on the table. She hadn't said it with anger. That might have been easier. She'd said it with sadness. "You used to believe in things you couldn't see," she'd told him. "You used to have faith, wonder. Now you're just empty, and I can't fill that space for you." He'd dismissed it then, told himself she didn't understand, that she wanted some fantasy version of spirituality he'd outgrown. But she'd been right. The being saw the memory without judging him. Lucas could feel the creature's awareness touching that painful moment, but there was no criticism in it, no disappointment, just witnessing. "The suffering contracted you," it said gently. Lucas felt his throat tighten. Contracted. That was exactly the word. He'd pulled inward, made himself smaller, built walls of equations and empirical data to protect himself from feeling anything too deeply. But love always waited for you. Lucas felt anger rise for the first time since the encounter began. Real anger, hot and defensive. It bubbled up from somewhere deep, a pressure that had been building for 3 years. "Why me?" His voice came out harsh. "I'm just a broken scientist. Why show me this? Why not someone who still has faith? Someone who deserves it?" The being's dark eyes held his without flinching. "It's in the broken that light enters," it responded. The phrase dismantled Lucas's defenses. Every wall he'd constructed, every rational argument he'd prepared, every reason he had for being unworthy, all of it collapsed. Because he understood suddenly that the craft wasn't the only damaged object here. He'd been fractured too, split open by loss and disappointment and the slow erosion of meaning. The crack in the core was his crack. The leaking light was his leaking life force. He'd been dying too, just slower, just quietly enough that he could pretend it wasn't happening. His breathing returned slow and painful. Each inhale felt like pulling air through broken ribs, but he kept breathing, kept standing there in the blue light while everything he'd built came apart. The visitor approached without touching him. It maintained that careful distance, respecting Lucas's space even as it invaded his mind with uncomfortable truth. "You've never been alone since you were born," the being said softly. Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the nights he'd spent in empty hotel rooms and isolated field stations, all the dinners eaten in silence, all the conversations he'd had only with himself. But even as the objections formed, he knew they missed the point. The being wasn't talking about physical proximity. It was talking about something else, some connection that existed underneath the surface reality, some thread that linked all consciousness together, invisible but unbreakable. Lucas thought about the spiral, the same pattern in galaxies and cells and souls. If that was true, if everything really was made from the same architectural template, then separation was illusion. Loneliness was a story he'd been telling himself. "I feel alone," he said, and his voice cracked. "I know," the being replied. "Feeling is real even when the story underneath it isn't true." Lucas looked at the creature, this impossible visitor from beyond his comprehension. It was dying when he'd found it, separated from its craft, from its home, from whatever civilization had sent it here. If anyone had reason to feel alone, it was this being. Yet it radiated connection. Even wounded and weakened, it seemed to exist in relationship with everything around it. The craft, the air, the desert, Lucas himself. "How do you do it?" Lucas asked. "How do you not feel separate?" "I remember," the being said simply. "You forgot, but you're starting to remember now." And Lucas began to believe, not in the theological sense, not in doctrines or denominations or any particular religious framework. He began to believe in the possibility of connection, in the reality of consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent, in love as an actual force in the universe, not just a chemical reaction in the brain. He began to believe that his brokenness wasn't disqualification. It was doorway. The cracks in his certainty, in his carefully constructed worldview, in his defended heart, those weren't failures. They were where the light could enter, where new understanding could slip through, where transformation became possible. His ex-wife had been wrong about one thing. She'd said he was empty, but he wasn't empty. He was broken open, and that meant he could be filled with something new, something true. Lucas looked back at the craft. The core pulsed steadily now, stronger than before, but not yet complete. The fracture had closed partially, but still needed work, still needed attention. Like him. "What do I do now?" he asked. The being's expression, if it could be called that, softened. "You finish what you started. You complete the healing. Yours and mine." Lucas nodded slowly. His anger had burned off, leaving something clearer in its wake. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but willingness, openness, the beginning of trust in something larger than his own understanding. He walked back toward the craft. His hands no longer trembled. His breath came steady. The fear that had driven him for 3 years, fear of meaninglessness, fear of being wrong, fear of hoping for something that might not exist. That fear was still there, but it didn't control him anymore. The being watched him approach with those infinite dark eyes, waiting, patient, knowing what Lucas was only beginning to suspect. That this wasn't just about fixing a broken machine, it was about fixing a broken man. And maybe, in the mystery of consciousness interacting with matter, those two things weren't separate at all. Maybe they'd never been separate. Lucas placed his hands back on the core. It pulsed warm beneath his palms, alive, responsive, real. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it. The fracture in the core would require emotional precision. Lucas understood that now. This wasn't mechanical work. It was something else entirely, a fusion of intention and attention, of consciousness and matter. He stepped into the deeper part of the ravine with his tools and newfound courage. The blue light surrounded him, warm and alive. The craft's hull shifted colors as he moved closer, acknowledging his presence. The light oscillated to the rhythm of his feelings. When doubt crept in, it dimmed. When certainty returned, it brightened. The feedback was immediate, undeniable. His internal state was directly affecting external reality. "Calm your heart before you touch," the being said from behind him. Lucas stopped, closed his eyes. His heart was racing, not from fear now, but from something else. Anticipation. The edge of understanding, something vast. He breathed deeply and remembered the vision of Jesus. That calm presence. That simple certainty. Not the certainty of knowing all the answers, but the certainty of being held by something larger than questions. The fear diminished, giving way to a calm he'd never experienced. It wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the presence of trust, of surrender, of letting go of control while somehow becoming more focused than ever. When he opened his eyes, the world looked different, sharper, more vivid, as if he'd been seeing through a filter his whole life and someone had just removed it. The core's light aligned with his internal frequency. He felt the moment it happened, a click, like two magnets finding their proper orientation. The pulsing synchronized with his heartbeat. The blue radiance matched the rhythm of his breath. He wasn't controlling it. He was harmonizing with it. Lucas placed his hands on either side of the fracture. The material reacted as if it knew his name, as if it had been waiting specifically for him, for this moment, for this exact quality of presence he was bringing. His training said this was impossible. Metal didn't respond to emotion. Materials didn't know names. Machines didn't recognize consciousness. But this wasn't metal. Not really. And maybe his training had been teaching him a simplified version of reality all along. The kindergarten explanation while the universe operated on graduate-level principles. He began to work. But work wasn't the right word. He wasn't forcing anything. Wasn't imposing his will on resistant matter. He was cooperating, dancing, following a lead while also leading, moving in partnership with the material itself. His hands knew what to do. The knowledge came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. His fingers traced the edges of the crack, and energy flowed from him, or through him, he couldn't tell which, into the damaged structure. The fracture began to close. Not like welding, not like gluing, like healing, like watching skin knit itself back together in time-lapse. The material remembered its wholeness and returned to it. Lucas soldered the opening with a method that felt almost intuitive. He used his tools, but they seemed almost incidental. The real work was happening at a level his instruments couldn't measure, a level where consciousness touched matter and matter responded by reorganizing itself. The spiral expanded and blazed like an underground sun. Light poured from the core in waves, not of heat, but of pure vitality. The entire craft seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The vessel vibrated with silent gratitude. Lucas felt it through his hands, through his chest, through every cell. Not anthropomorphic gratitude, machines didn't feel thankful, but some quality of rightness, of restoration, of systems coming back online after critical failure. The being stood. Its movements were stronger, more stable. The translucent quality of its skin had returned to proper luminescence. The blue veins pulsed in healthy rhythm. Its large eyes were brighter, clearer. "You healed more than metal," it said, and the mental voice carried weight beyond the words. Lucas looked at his hands. They were steady, calm. The trembling that had plagued him for 3 years, the physical manifestation of internal chaos, was gone. He felt his chest open like a window, not metaphorically. Actually, as if a tight band he hadn't known was there had suddenly released. Air flowed deeper into his lungs. His heart beat fuller in his chest. Space opened inside him that he'd forgotten existed, and he knew nothing would ever be the same. Not because he'd encountered an alien, not because he'd seen a vision of Jesus, not because he'd witnessed impossible things in a desert ravine, but because he'd remembered something fundamental about how reality works, about who he was underneath the stories and defenses and carefully constructed limitations. He'd remembered that consciousness wasn't product. It was foundation, That love wasn't sentiment, it was technology. That faith wasn't belief in unprovable things. It was alignment with the deepest truth of existence. The core blazed steady now, perfect, whole. The crack was gone, replaced by seamless material that showed no trace of ever having been broken. Lucas stepped back, looking at his work. His hands still tingled with the energy that had flowed through them. His whole body hummed with aliveness he hadn't felt since before the divorce, before the loss of faith, before he'd chosen safety over wonder. The being approached the craft, placed its hand on the hull. The connection between them was visible now, light flowing from core to creature, restoring, revitalizing, reuniting. "Thank you," it said aloud, its voice actual sound for the first time. Soft, musical, alien but somehow familiar. Lucas nodded. Words felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate except this moment, this presence, this undeniable reality of transformation. He had come into this ravine as one person. He would leave as another. Not better or worse, just truer, more aligned with what had always been underneath. The scientist in him wanted to document everything, to analyze and measure and prove. But the man in him, the whole man, healed and breaking and alive, knew that some things transcended proof. Some things you just knew. And he knew this was real. They walked out of the rocky ravine together. Lucas's legs felt stronger than they had in years. Each step seemed to carry more certainty, more presence. The desert looked different now, more alive. The sand wasn't just granular silicon dioxide. It shimmered with subtle energy. The rock formations didn't just sit there inert. They breathed with geological time, ancient and patient. Everything pulsed with being. The being explained as they walked, its mental voice steady and clear. Everything in the universe is consciousness at different densities. Lucas stopped, looked around, at the rocks, the sky, his own hands. Matter is just slowed down light. The being continued. Lucas's scientific training immediately wanted to object. Matter was matter. Light was light. Different things, different categories. E or MC2 was an equivalence formula, not a literal statement about transformation. Except it was literal, wasn't it? Energy and mass were interchangeable. Matter was condensed energy, and light was energy in its purest form. So matter really was slowed down light, frozen photons, crystallized radiance, and thought is light in movement, the being added. Lucas listened with respect and wonder. The science he knew seemed like a child's version of reality now, true as far as it went, but missing the deeper architecture, missing the consciousness that undergirded everything. He'd spent decades studying the material world as if it were separate from the mental world, subject and object, observer and observed, mind and matter, fundamental categories. But what if they'd never been separate? What if consciousness came first, and matter was just consciousness looking at itself from a particular angle? Jesus came to activate humanity's lost consciousness, the being said. They'd stopped at a flat section of stone. The being turned to face him, those dark eyes holding infinite patience. Love was the most advanced technology you'd ever seen. Lucas felt the words land in his chest like physical impact. Technology, not metaphor, not spiritual poetry. Actual, functional technology. A method for reorganizing reality at the quantum level. He remembered how he'd survived the divorce without any love at all. Just grief, anger, numbness. He'd treated those years like endurance test. Get through each day. Don't feel too much. Wait for time to make it hurt less. And it had worked, sort of. The pain dulled. Life became manageable. But manageable wasn't the same as alive. He realized he'd been living against his own nature. Humans were built for connection, for love, for resonance with others. Choosing isolation wasn't neutral. It was violence against his own design. Like trying to run a car on the wrong fuel, it might keep moving, but the engine suffered. The being showed him, not with words, but with direct knowing, that guilt is a vibration that contracts and sickens. He felt it in his body, the tight band around his chest, the shallow breathing, the constant low-grade tension. That was guilt, operating as frequency, literally compressing his cells. And compassion reorganizes everything it touches. When he'd felt genuine care for the dying being, when he'd chosen to help despite fear, his entire system had shifted, opened, expanded. The material of the craft had responded, but so had his own biology. Frequency affecting frequency, consciousness shaping matter. Lucas understood that faith is vibration, not submission, not believing things on insufficient evidence, not bowing to authority, but tuning yourself to a particular frequency, aligning with love instead of fear, with expansion instead of contraction, with coherence instead of chaos. That's what prayer actually was, not asking an external deity for favors, but adjusting your own broadcast frequency. When Jesus said, "Your faith has healed you," he meant it literally. The person's shift into coherent belief changed their vibration, and their body responded by reorganizing itself. And the truth had always been wider than he'd imagined. He'd thought choosing between science and spirituality was necessary, that you could have empirical rigor or mystical experience, but not both. But that was false dichotomy. The universe didn't care about human categories. Reality operated on principles that were simultaneously measurable and mysterious, quantifiable and numinous, scientific and sacred. Both. Always both. Why don't more people know this? Lucas asked. His voice sounded different to his own ears. Clearer, stronger. The being tilted its head slightly. Some do. You're mystics. You're physicists at the edge of understanding. You're artists and poets and children before they're taught to separate things. But mainstream science is catching up. The being interrupted gently. Quantum mechanics already shows that observation affects outcome, that consciousness collapses probability waves. Your scientists just haven't fully accepted the implications yet. Lucas thought about his colleagues. Good people, smart people, dedicated to truth, but working within a paradigm that excluded half of reality. Not from malice, from training, from the weight of institutional inertia. He'd been the same way until tonight. What changed? He asked. Why can I see this now when I couldn't before? The being's expression, if it could be called that, softened. You broke. The crack let light in, and you chose not to seal it back up with old certainties. Lucas looked at his hands again. They'd sealed the craft's crack. But his own crack, the one the divorce had opened, the one loss of faith had widened, that one remained. Still tender, still vulnerable, still letting light through. Will it always feel this raw? He asked quietly. No, the being said. You'll integrate this, make it your new foundation, but you'll never be able to unsee what you've seen, never be able to unknow what you now know. Lucas nodded. He didn't want to unknow it, didn't want to go back to comfortable ignorance. The truth was too vast, too beautiful, too real, even if it meant living with uncertainty, even if it meant never quite fitting into the old boxes again. The desert wind blew warm across his face. The stars blazed overhead with new significance, each one a sun, each sun surrounded by potential worlds, each world potentially holding consciousness exploring itself, all of it connected, all of it, one thing looking at itself from billions of perspectives, and he was part of it, had always been part of it, would always be part of it. The loneliness he'd carried dissolved, not because someone was with him now, but because aloneness itself was revealed as impossible. An illusion created by forgetting the deeper connection. Thank you, Lucas said simply. The being placed its three-fingered hand over its chest, a gesture of acknowledgement, of mutual respect. You saved my life, it said, but more importantly, you remembered yours. Lucas walked to the edge of the illuminated cliff. The ravine dropped away below him, deeper in shadow now as the craft's light stabilized to a steady pulse rather than the earlier blazing intensity. The desert breathed like a living organism. He could feel it now, the slow exchange of heat between sand and air, the patient weathering of stone, the network of roots far underground, holding moisture, waiting, all of it alive, all of it conscious in its own way. He began connecting science and spirituality for the first time, not forcing them together, just seeing how they'd never actually been separate. Geology was the study of conscious matter organizing itself over deep time. Physics was consciousness exploring its own rules. Biology was consciousness learning to reproduce itself. His cosmos geology, the study of how geological processes might work on other worlds, found sudden purpose in the invisible. He wasn't just studying rocks anymore. He was studying how consciousness manifested in different densities and conditions. Matter reads emotional state, the being explained, coming to stand beside him at the cliff edge. Lucas looked at the creature. Its health had fully returned. The translucent skin glowed with proper vitality. It seemed completely restored, as if the near-death state from hours ago had never happened. And it responds like a quantum mirror, the being continued. Lucas thought about quantum mechanics, the observer effect, Schrödinger's cat, the double-slit experiment, all those strange results that seemed to show consciousness affecting physical systems. He'd learned them as curious anomalies, interesting puzzles. But what if they were the main story? What if consciousness affecting matter wasn't an edge case, but the fundamental dynamic? He looked at his equipment scattered near the ravine, the geological sensors, the spectrometer, the sample containers, all of it registering luminous anomalies now, readings that made no sense within standard models. Nothing behaved the way it had before the encounter. The electromagnetic fields were wrong. The spectroscopic signatures were off. Even the background radiation showed patterns it shouldn't. The equipment was responding to the shifted consciousness in the area, to his shifted consciousness. He felt like he was seeing the universe without filter for the first time, not through the lens of materialist assumptions, not through the distortion of separation between mind and matter, just direct, immediate, true. The visitor smiled with tranquil eyes. The expression was subtle, just a slight change in the quality of its gaze, but unmistakable. "You're remembering who you are," it said softly. Lucas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Remembering. That was exactly what it felt like. Not learning something new, recovering something ancient. He'd always known this. Somewhere beneath the layers of education and socialization and cultural conditioning, some part of him had always known that reality was bigger, stranger, more intimate than the official story suggested. He dropped the tool in his hand, let it fall to the sand, and laughed quietly. The sound surprised him. He hadn't laughed, really laughed, from genuine joy rather than social obligation since before the divorce. Maybe longer, but this moment demanded it. The absurdity and beauty of it all, that he'd had to meet a dying alien in the desert to remember what he'd known as a child, that the universe had to break open his comfortable atheism with impossible visions to show him what mystics had been saying for millennia, that he'd traveled so far from home to discover he'd never actually left. He understood that his journey had never been only scientific, the PhD, the research positions, the fieldwork in isolated locations. He'd told himself it was about advancing human knowledge, contributing to understanding of planetary formation and geological processes. But the search had always been for meaning, not just data, for connection, for purpose, for something that would make the brief flicker of human existence feel significant against the vast indifference of cosmic time. He'd been looking for God in the rocks, and in a way, he'd been right to look there, because God wasn't somewhere else, waiting to be found. God was the looking itself, the consciousness investigating itself through the form called Lucas Whitford, and he'd finally found both. The data and the meaning, the science and the sacred, the measurement and the mystery, they'd been the same thing all along. He turned to the being. "What happens now?" The creature gestured toward its craft. "I return, continue my work, and me, you continue yours, but differently, seeing what you now see, knowing what you now know." Lucas nodded. His old life, the lonely field work, the mechanical data collection, the refuge in pure empiricism, that was over. He couldn't go back to it even if he wanted to, but he didn't want to, not anymore. He had work to do, real work, bridging the false gap between science and spirit, showing others what he'd discovered, not preaching, not evangelizing, just living from this new understanding and letting the results speak for themselves. The being watched him with those patient dark eyes, knowing, understanding, seeing the transformation complete itself in real time. "You'll be okay," it said. Not question, statement. Lucas smiled. For the first time in 3 years, he believed it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I will." The desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Lucas Whitford stood at the edge of a cliff, broken open and finely whole. The craft rose slowly from the ravine. Its hull gleamed in the starlight, no longer the desperate pulsing of a dying machine, but the steady radiance of restored vitality. The light enveloped the being with a bluish aura. It stood at the base of the craft, its form outlined in that otherworldly glow. For a moment, it simply looked at Lucas across the sand. Then it placed its hand over its chest in a distinctly human gesture. The movement was deliberate, meaningful, a bridge between their two kinds of existence. "You saved me," it said with serene depth. The telepathic voice carried layers Lucas hadn't heard before. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition, respect, the acknowledgement of one consciousness to another, meeting as equals despite their vast differences. "But you saved something in yourself too." Lucas felt tears he hadn't shed in years. They came suddenly, unexpectedly, breaking through defenses he'd forgotten were still in place. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. He wasn't crying from sadness, or even from joy exactly. It was release, pure release. Years of holding himself together, of refusing to feel too much, of maintaining careful control, all of it dissolving. The tears fell hot on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. The visitor looked toward the sky, ready to depart. Its body already seemed lighter, less anchored to earth. The connection between it and the craft was visible now, strands of light linking them, preparing for reunion. "Jesus is not myth or dogma," it stated clearly. Lucas listened through his tears, every word landing like stone dropped in still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his entire understanding. He is a state of consciousness available to everyone. Lucas felt this as undeniable truth, not belief, not hope, certainty, the kind of knowing that lives in your bones, that requires no external validation because it validates itself through direct experience. Jesus wasn't a historical figure to worship from a distance, wasn't a theological puzzle to solve, wasn't a denominational property to fight over. Jesus was a frequency, a way of being, a demonstrated possibility of what human consciousness could become when it remembered its divine origin. And that frequency was still here, still accessible, still broadcasting for anyone willing to tune in. The craft pulsed and began to levitate. Sand scattered beneath it, blown outward by forces Lucas's instruments couldn't measure. The blue light intensified, beautiful and alien and somehow familiar all at once. The spiral in the core blazed one final time for him. Lucas watched it rotate, that perfect geometric pattern that existed everywhere, in galaxies and hurricanes, and the chambers of his own heart. He understood now. The spiral was the shape of consciousness evolving, moving outward and inward simultaneously, expanding while deepening, growing while returning to source. The being's eyes met his across the increasing distance. "When you choose love, you'll see again," it said. Not a promise of physical return, something else. A promise that the connection they'd formed existed outside of space and time. That consciousness meeting consciousness created bonds that didn't break just because bodies separated. Choose love, and the vision returns. Choose coherence over chaos, expansion over contraction, connection over isolation, and the direct knowing remains accessible. The craft tore through the air and disappeared over the horizon. It didn't accelerate gradually. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, silent except for a faint vibration that lingered in Lucas's chest. The silence of the desert was divine response, not empty silence, full silence, the kind that contains everything rather than nothing. The silence between heartbeats, between thoughts, the silence that is pure presence. Lucas stood alone on the sand, looking at the space where the craft had been. The stars blazed overhead, indifferent and intimate at once. The wind carried scents he'd never noticed before, minerals in the rock, moisture deep underground, the ghost of ancient seas that had covered this land millions of years ago. Everything spoke, everything responded. The universe was constant conversation, and he'd just learned how to hear it. He would never see the being again, knew that with certainty, but he also knew with equal certainty that the encounter had changed him permanently. You don't witness the impossible and return unchanged. You don't touch the sacred and remain safely secular. He'd been broken open, and what had entered through the cracks wasn't something foreign. It was remembering, recognition, the return of knowledge he'd carried before birth and would carry after death. Lucas turned away from the horizon, looked back toward his camp, visible in the distance as small shapes against endless sand. His equipment, his tent, his old life waiting there, patient and unchanged. But he was different now, and that made everything different. He took a step, then another, walking back toward the familiar with new eyes. The being was gone, but the truth remained. The frequency remained. The connection remained. And Lucas walked through the desert night carrying light he didn't have before. Not external light, not borrowed light, his own light, remembered and reclaimed. The tears had stopped, his breathing had steadied, but something fundamental had shifted in his chest. A door had opened that would never fully close again, and he was grateful for it, grateful for the breaking, grateful for the encounter, grateful for the impossible night that had shown him what was real underneath the safe stories he'd been telling himself. The desert stretched vast in every direction, empty and full, silent and singing. Just like him, Lucas stood alone beneath the immense sky. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, more visible out here than anywhere else he'd been. Each star a sun, each sun potentially warming worlds where consciousness explored itself. His heart beat in a new rhythm, harmonized. He could feel it, not metaphorically but actually. The cadence had changed, steadier, deeper, like his cardiovascular system had recalibrated to match some cosmic pulse. He walked back to camp with light steps. His boots touched sand the same way they had hours before, but everything felt different. The earth seemed to rise up to meet him, rather than simply existing beneath him. Relationship instead of separation. He felt that he no longer needed to run from himself. The flight that had brought him to the desert, that had kept him isolated in field work for 3 years, that had made loneliness seem safer than connection, it was over. Not because the pain was gone, but because he'd learned to be with it differently. Pain wasn't enemy, it was teacher, signal, the body's way of saying, pay attention here. Science and faith finally embraced in his chest, not as opposites forced together, but as aspects of the same thing, recognizing each other after long separation. The precision of measurement and the openness of mystery, the rigor of evidence and the surrender of awe, both true, both necessary, both incomplete without the other. He reached his tent and found his field journal, old leather cover, pages filled with geological observations, sample notes, data tables, the handwriting of a man trying to find meaning in measurements. He wrote everything down. Not as proof, he knew no one would believe him, and that was fine. Not as scientific record, this lived beyond the reach of peer review. He wrote from gratitude, from the need to honor what had happened by acknowledging it, by saying, this was real, and I witnessed it. His hand moved across the page, and words flowed that he didn't plan. About the being, about the craft, about Jesus appearing as frequency rather than figure, about love as technology and consciousness as foundation. The memory of his ex-wife came without pain, only understanding. He saw her face clearly, not the hurt and frustrated version from their final months, but her true face, the woman who'd loved him before he closed himself off, who'd tried to reach him when he retreated into empirical safety. She'd been right about so much. He just hadn't been ready to hear it. Lucas silently forgave the past, not in the sense of pardoning wrongdoing, in the deeper sense of releasing it, letting the story be what it was without needing to change it or justify it or carry it forward as defining weight. What happened, happened. He'd been who he was capable of being at the time. So had she. And now he was different. That was enough. The desert seemed to respond with warm wind. It touched his face gently, like breath, like blessing. The land acknowledged his transformation the way it acknowledged rain, as natural shift, as appropriate change, as the way things move when they're following their true nature. He understood that healing is always returned to love, not finding something new but remembering something original, getting back to the frequency you were born carrying before fear and pain and defensive conditioning distorted it. The spiral he'd seen in the craft's core now echoed inside him. He could feel it, not physically, but as surely as he felt his heartbeat. The same pattern playing out in his consciousness, expanding outward while deepening inward, growing while returning. It was symbol of origin and destination simultaneously, where you came from and where you're going, alpha and omega, beginning and end, the same point seen from different angles. What he'd witnessed tonight would never be forgotten, couldn't be forgotten. It had carved itself into him at a level deeper than memory, cellular, structural, the kind of knowing that changes how you see everything else forever after. And he knew the awakening had begun, not completed, not finished, but initiated, started. set in motion like a stone rolling downhill, gathering momentum. This was just the beginning of seeing differently, of being differently, of engaging with reality from the truth of consciousness rather than the illusion of separation. He would return to his work, but differently, would publish papers and present findings, but from a foundation that included both measurement and mystery, would interact with colleagues and students, but carrying knowledge that most of them hadn't yet remembered. It would be lonely sometimes, being awake while others slept, seeing what remained invisible to most, but it was better than the old loneliness, better than the loneliness of pretending, of shrinking himself to fit into boxes too small for what he now knew to be true. And in the illuminated silence of the desert, Lucas felt it with complete certainty. God had never been distant. The divine hadn't abandoned him during his years of atheism. The sacred hadn't withdrawn when he'd turned to science. He was the one who'd forgotten. He was the one who'd stopped looking. He was the one who'd told himself that consciousness was accident and love was chemistry and meaning was projection. But the light had always been there, inside him, around him. The fundamental fabric of existence itself, patiently waiting for him to remember how to see it. And now he saw. Not perfectly, not completely, but truly. Lucas closed his journal. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert breathed its ancient breath, and a broken scientist sat in the sand, finally whole.